Hi friends, and thanks for tuning in. In this video, I'll show you how to print a return address on the back flap of an envelope, something like this, using Microsoft Word. So let's go. The first thing you need to know is what kind of envelope you're using. If you go out to Amazon and search for envelope, a number 10 is common for business purposes. Maybe you're doing some invitations or some cards, something more like a 6 3/4, or whatever the case may be. Or if you just went to the store and bought some envelopes, there should be something on the box that says what size or what number it is. So whatever you're using, just make a note of that, and it's probably going to be supported in Word. Speaking of Word, let me open up a new document, and then we're going to go up to Mailings and Envelopes. Now the first thing I want to point out is that when you're using envelopes in Word, these are meant to print on the front of the envelope. So you have your return address and your delivery address. You'll see what that preview looks like here. If you were to click around to the different options from this box, you're not going to find anything that says print to the back of the envelope. So we're going to have to use a few different tricks to get this to work. First, we're only going to be using this return address right here. This would normally appear on the top left if you were printing on the front of the envelope. We aren't going to use the delivery address though. This would normally go in the middle of the envelope there if you're printing on front. So we're just going to leave that blank and only use the return address. Next, we need to go into Options here. And this is where we're going to set the details of the envelope we're using and how it's going to feed through the printer. So for envelope size, I have that size 10 that we saw from Amazon, but if you're using a different size, the 6 3/4, or some of these other options down here, then just make sure you select whatever that size is. If you don't see your particular envelope here, you can go down to Custom Size and then just manually enter the width and height for the envelope that you're using. So you should be able to use pretty much anything you want here. But I'm going to go with that size 10 that I have. And you should be able to leave everything else the same here for the delivery address and the return address. On the Printing Options tab up here, here's where we need to figure out how these envelopes are going to be fed through the printer. And you've got different options here, feeding through face up or face down. You can also do a clockwise rotation. These pictures here should be self-explanatory, but let me just show you some examples from my actual printer that might help. Looking at that icon on the top left there, this is a face up position of the envelope, and I'm feeding it through the middle of my printer. This is also face up, but I'm feeding it through the left of the printer. And this is an example of face down going through the middle of the printer. So you might have slightly different options, but generally that's how those little icons actually compare to the real printer as you're feeding things through. All right, back to Word here. Now that we understand what these pictures mean, we actually need to do the opposite of whatever you choose here. Because remember, Word is normally used to print on the front of the envelope, not the back. So we basically need to flip things here. For me, I'm going to choose the face down option in Word, feeding it through the middle of the printer. But again, because that would normally print on the front of the envelope, I need to physically load it the other way. So in my printer, I'm loading it face up instead. So basically doing the reverse or the opposite of what I'm choosing in Word. Hopefully that makes sense. So here I'm choosing face down through the middle of the printer, and feed from, I'm going to automatically select this, and my printer should recognize where those envelopes are loaded. You might have different options here depending on your printer, but an automatic selection is probably going to work in most cases. Okay, so we're good there. I'll click OK. Next, we're going to say Add to Document, and this will put the text in the actual document back behind here. If this is your first time working with envelopes, you might get a prompt here asking if you want to save your return address as the default. You can say yes if you want to do that. I did that earlier, so this is my default, but just a heads up that you might get that prompt. So Add to Document, and here's our envelope. You'll see that it's formatted as if we're printing on the front. So we have our return address up here and the delivery address right here. If you don't see this, you might need to turn on formatting. So up here on Home, just make sure that you're showing hiding formatting and you'll see this. Since we don't actually need this delivery address, you can just delete it if you want. I'll hit the delete key on my keyboard. And the only thing we care about is this return address up here, which we're actually going to use to print on the back flap of the envelope. Now, depending on the envelope you're using, you could just leave it up here In most cases though, I think you're probably going to want to center it on that flap. You might want to move it down a line or two, so I'm just hitting the return key there. You'll probably just have to print a couple and see how this comes out. Mine actually prints okay if I just leave it at the very top and center it here. You could also increase the font size or the color or whatever you want to do, so I'll bump mine up to a size 12. But you can format just as you would anything else in Word. Now you will notice that you get a second page here. We have this section break that's basically pushing us down to a second page. And this allows us to get the top page to be the right size. You'll see this is the size of the envelope up here. There are ways to get rid of this second page here, but I find it easier just to print the first page when you go to print it. So let's look at that now. I'll come up to File and Print. And this next part is really going to depend on what printer you have. You'll probably have different options than I do. The printer I'm using is an HP OfficeJet, and you can see that the envelope size is automatically selected here for me. I could update that if for some reason it didn't come over with the envelope number 10, but generally everything should be updated here based on what we set up earlier. You can also come into Printer Properties here, check that everything looks okay. The paper source again is automatically selecting because I set that up earlier. You can change color, black and white, and so forth. So generally everything should be okay here, but you will want to update the pages that it's printing. So again, we don't really care about this second page. That's the full-size page. We just want the first page. So you want to say just print page 1. Initially, I would recommend just printing one copy just so you can get things aligned correctly. And then when you go to actually print these, print 15 or 20 or 200 or however many you have. But I'm just going to go with one and say print. And let me show you a picture of what I get. There we go. Now I did come across a couple issues myself when I was preparing for this video. You might as well, so let me just show you a couple of those gotchas and how I fixed them. First is that the address wasn't centered on the flap, even though I had centered it in the Word doc. This might depend on your envelope and how the feeder works on your printer, but let me just show you what I did for this. Back here in Word, you just need to move the address over a little bit, and then make sure that your ruler is on, this thing right up here. If it's not on by default, you can come up to View and Ruler. But there on the ruler, mouse over the very bottom of this control here. It should say left indent. Then click it, pick it up, and you can move the whole text over. You'll probably just need to play with this and print a couple to see where it ultimately ends up, but I think mine ended up right about there, and even though it doesn't look centered on the page here, it was centered on the flap when I actually printed the envelope. Another issue that I had was that the address actually printed crooked like this. This was happening when I was just feeding one envelope through the printer at a time. I think when the printer went to pick up the envelope, there was just a little bit too much wiggle room there in the feeder, and so it was getting a little bit wonky. For me, at least, I found that it was better if I loaded a handful of envelopes into the feeder so that things were more snug when that top envelope got picked up for printing. So hopefully that works for you as well. But that's it. That's how to print on the back of an envelope. If you found it helpful, I'd appreciate you hitting that like button, and also consider subscribing for more content like this. Thank you so much for watching.